I'm Vicki Hanson. I'm professor at the University of Dundee and also professor at Rochester Institute of Technology in New York. And I'm here in the position also as vice president of the ACM, the Association for Computing Machinery. And as a representative of ACM, I have to say that I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to have said we sponsored this event in part. And I just want to give a very brief thank you to Ursula and her colleagues for such a wonderful event that they put together for the last few days. Okay, so we have some great talks coming up this morning. Our first speaker is June Barrow-Green from the Open University.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, I'd like to also say thank you all very much for getting up and being here. I was sort of expecting one man and his dog, so it's really nice to see so many people. And also a big thanks to Ursula as well, for we just had a fantastic day yesterday, and there's, I know, some fantastic talks after mine. And I'm, like one of the speakers yesterday, sort of here because Ursula was talking to me about the meeting that she was trying to organize, and she showed me something which you'll have seen often now and you're going to see again. And I started wittering in the way that I do, and she said, "That sounds great, you're in the program." And I thought, what did I say? So anyway, so I said, well, it was really to do with about mathematical archives or mathematics in archives and the kind of some of the things that you can find. And I just thought that this is just a sort of scattergun approach to a few things. So the title it is sort of germane because this is the folio that you saw yesterday, and Ursula mentioned the Königsberg bridges, and the thing that struck me was this diagram here, and I'll just blow it up, and hopefully most of you will recognize that as being the Pythagorean theorem in a particular form. So that's where the Pythagoras comes from in my talk, and the pacifism bit comes at the end. So that was, and so then when I thought about the Pythagorean theorem, and I thought, well, I'm going to be in Oxford, something else that you should certainly see is the amazing Euclid, the 9th century Euclid that's here in the Bodleian, and has been digitized thanks to funds provided by the Clay Mathematics Institute. And just in case you can't quite see it, that's the Pythagorean theorem diagram there. And I just really recommend, if you haven't ever looked at this, the website's fantastic. You can look at this in really great detail. And it is just amazing. It's 9th century. It's a full edition of Euclid. It's the earliest we have. And it's just marvelous that it's here in Oxford, and that it's now available for everyone in the world to see. So what other things? Well, so thinking about Euclid, maybe think about Greek mathematics, and then of course I thought about Archimedes Palimpsest, and the historians of mathematics among you won't be learning anything new about this, but maybe some of you haven't heard about this story before. So this rather tattered looking book, in this form as you see it here, it's the main writing you can just see on it is as a Byzantine prayer book from the 13th century. But in fact, it's a palimpsest, which means that this parchment was reused to make it into the prayer book. So what they did was wash down what was already there, turn it through 90 degrees and rebind it. And what's underneath was the Archimedes works of Archimedes. And this book was actually in a monastery in Turkey, I think. And it was first photographed by Heiberg in 1906. And it was just incredible, actually, that he was able to read it and see it and do what he could with it. But of course, it was still bound in that form. Now, when he saw it, it was in actually much better condition than that. it somehow disappeared from the monastery, and then it re-emerged later. And when it re-emerged, it was in this rather worse condition. I put this picture of Archimedes up here because it's just a little pet bugbear of mine. So if I have an opportunity to say something about it, I do. In this particular case, of course, I think most people would realize that this isn't a portrait from life. But of course, with these Greek mathematicians, what we do often we get busts and things of them. And people can be slightly seduced into thinking that those were from life as well. And of course, they're not. So I just wanted a little sort of reminder about that. But so that's why that picture's there. And in another life, I used to work in an art gallery, but that's another story. So this was the Archimedes Palimpsest. It appeared in Christie's in New York in 1998, where it was sold for $2 million. And you can see, I think, here how the writing is at right angles. And it was bought by an anonymous buyer and has been subject to fantastic restoration and work by scholars from many, many different fields in order to bring up the Archimedes works back to life. And I just wanted to sort of draw attention to the fact that this is just such a marvelous conjunction of modern technology and ancient text. And this particular, these pictures I've got here show where they're actually looking at one of the pages of the palimpsest, what happened in between 1906 and when it appeared in Christie's. Somebody thought that it would make it more valuable if it had some pictures in it. So they put some pictures in. And they copied them from a text of a sort of the right kind of date. And just by a marvelous, really piece of sort of serendipity, one of the experts who, when they were first looking at them, thought they recognized one of the pictures, and indeed they did. They saw it was an exact copy from another text. And this is just this slide just sort of shows how they're looking at the machinery and technology that's they're using to kind of go sort of behind the picture and see the writing and so on. And there's plenty out there on the web. They've got a very nice website about it. And again, if you're interested, it's just an extraordinary story, and it's fantastic that we've actually got this Archimedes text. And again, it's like the Euclid one, of course. It's several centuries after Archimedes. One has to remember, actually, it's closer in time to us than it is to Archimedes. And the similar thing with the Euclid text, actually. So moving forward in time a bit, the Pearl Manuscripts in the British Library. And this is sort of out of my period. I should say I'm really a 19th, early 20th century person. But I have a postgraduate student who was looking at these manuscripts, Rosie Cretney, and she was trying to see whether there was something in these manuscripts that related to some work she was doing on continued fractions, and she was looking for some particular numbers. Well, it turns out that these manuscripts are rather large and rather disorganized, and they've been described by our dear late colleague Jackie Steddall. 30 substantial volumes, several of which contain as many as 300 or 400 pages of assorted notes, tables, rough work and jottings. Many undated, untitled, many folios in the modern volumes contain collections of tiny scraps or fragments, carefully preserved, but in no semblance of order. So if you can imagine trying to go through these and find just a sort of sequence of numbers, effectively what Rosie was looking for, was really rather a hard task. But she is a student at the Open University, and people sort of felt, well, really, she should be doing her work at the Open University. Why don't you so the suggestion was made to her, well, why don't you get the British Library to digitize the Pearl manuscripts? And then you can sit at your desk and look for these numbers. So Rosie did a little sum and this was, I think it was in 2011 or around that time, whereupon the suggestion was withdrawn. But anyway, I mean, again, it's just to sort of draw your attention to some of the problems we face when we're, as historians of mathematics, trying to find things in archives, when you're trying to find connections between things, that you can be faced with a great pile of unordered material. Something else, another wonderful project now that's being digitized, the Newton project. Again, fantastic website, wonderful resource for us historians of maths. And one of the things I think you can see from something like this folio I've shown here, there's lots of things going on. There's diagrams, there's notation, there's writing, and actually trying to transcribe something like that and putting it into print is quite a difficult task. So again, it's marvelous that we can actually see the image for ourselves. And so far, they've transcribed 6.4 million words. That was the last time I looked at the website. They keep a kind of running total of what they're doing. So I mean, imagine trying to transcribe something like that. I mean, and then you have to make sense. Of course, there's text before it and after it, and so on. You can. You have to put it into context. But again, just to give you an idea of some of the sorts of things that historians of 17th century mathematics have to deal with. Now I'm going to jump right forward and to something that I've been working on. And this was a quotation from a talk given by David Hilbert, who was the leading German mathematician of his generation. And he gave this talk in Paris at the International Congress of Mathematicians. And in the talk, he lays out 23 problems, which come a bit extended later. And these Hilbert problems became really famous in the history of mathematics and in mathematics. They were the sort of almost like the agenda for pure mathematics for people to work on. And in the sort of prelude to actually the problems, he talked a lot about what was a good problem and so on and so forth. And one of the things he said was this. An old French mathematician said, a mathematical theory is not to be considered complete. So he made it so clear, you can explain it to the first man whom you meet on the street. So then the question was, who was the old French mathematician? So we thought, well, and actually with the anniversary of the Hilbert problems in the millennium, a lot of things were written about the problems and Hilbert's address, but one person at that point addressed the question. So there were various proposals. In 1937, someone suggested it was Lagrange. 2005, someone suggested it was Hermite. Now, the 1889 one, you might think, well, that is a little bit odd because Hilbert's writing in 1900. Well, it turns out, actually, that we found out that Hilbert took it from somebody else as an old French mathematician. And so Charles' name came up in connection with the previous person who'd used this. So we were still no kind of further forward. So it turned out that all of these were wrong. We found that out quite clearly. So what did we find out? Well, we found out that actually the person who it all came to was Jagon. And it went through Quetelet, through Charles, through Henry Smith, great professor of mathematics here at Oxford, and it was his talk. He framed it in almost the identical way to Hilbert, and we think it was from him that Hilbert got the phrase, so that's why he copied it exactly. But one of the things that we found in the correspondence between Jagon and Quetelet was that Jagon said, and I've often repeated this to my students, but we only had this one letter from Jagon to Quetelet, so we thought, well, do we have evidence for this? And then, of course, I remembered that rather curiously, because I'm a late 19th century person, I had my arm twisted a bit like sort of for being here today. I ended up doing some work on this person, William Henry Fox Talbot, and again, who's well known to most people as a pioneer in photography. So not the obvious place to be looking for quotes about old French mathematicians. But it turned out that in the correspondence of Fox Talbot, there was a letter from Jagon, this in French, this is an English translation, where he does repeat exactly this. And in fact, Talbot's early career was in mathematics. His first papers he published were in mathematics. And he had an interest in mathematics, actually, throughout his life, and the last papers he published were in mathematics. And in the course of doing my work on Fox Talbot, this is something I just can't resist showing, even though it's a little bit left field, was that in 1915, a mathematician writing about English mathematics used Fox Talbot as an example of sort of English mathematics. And he says, well, Fox Talbot now only vaguely remembered in connection with photography. You know, how times change. So I thought it's kind of quite interesting. Another person, I'm not going to go into this, but it's just sort of quite interesting, Felix Hausdorff, who is really one of the founders of modern topology, also had another life, another sort of literary life. So the scholars who've been working on his works have had to go through 26,000 pages of manuscripts, but they're also having to deal with his work as Paul Mongret, the literary side of him. So historians of mathematics get kind of pulled in lots of different directions. So it's just, and they're still working on these manuscripts. But so now, just for my last few moments, I want to get onto my pacifism bit of my talk. And this is a diary that I found in St John's College in Cambridge of a mathematics student. Francis Perrier-White was doing the mathematical tripos in 1915, and his diary for 1915 right up to July 1916 is there in St John's, and he writes about 2/3 of an A4 page every day. So it's an amazing document for somebody like me who's interested in trying to understand what sort of mathematics was being taught in Cambridge at the time. I mean, of course, you get lecture lists and so on, but to get a student's perspective, also get the student's perspective on his lecturers, so it was quite interesting. He's really, it's full of all kinds of things. But here we have, this is the very first entry in the diary. And actually, what he's doing, his parents lived in Islington, actually not very far away as it happens from where I live. And he on the first day of the diary, he goes to the V&A to see the Rodin exhibition. And this was an exhibition of Rodin sculptures that Rodin had donated to the V&A to honour the French and British soldiers fighting in the First World War. But it's kind of not a likely place that if you were a Rodin scholar to be thinking, a student, a maths student at Cambridge. And this diary is full of sort of lots of things like that, so we'll point out one or two others. So this is another one. It turns out he's very interested in law. So he goes off to the law courts, and so he reports on the things that he hears. So this particular one, he's about to go, it looks a bit boring, and then he sees the lawyers coming in with the Tatler and various things. He says, oh ho, looks like a libel action, whoopee, and then he sees Gladys Cooper, and actually to find out she wanted to see who she was, and actually he didn't think she was very beautiful, even though she was kind of one of the classic beauties of the day, and so on. So, I mean, there's lots of sort of things here. And then the sort of pacifism side of the story is that he is a pacifist himself through religious conviction. And so he goes to all these meetings. So he joined the Union of Democratic Control. This was they were set up it wasn't strictly pacifist, it was just to sort of stop interference for government and foreign policy and so on. And it was a really important group, and they were against conscription and various things. And the other wonderful thing in the diary is that he sticks into the diary all these invitations, various bits of paper and stuff. So we actually have these documents. And it's interesting for us as historians of mathematics particularly because G.H. Hardy, who was sort of leading British mathematician, pure mathematician of his generation really, is very much features in this particular story. So we can trace White's what happens to him and various other people who are conscientious objectors. And in reading the diary, I sort of found out and discovered that actually there were proportionately rather more mathematicians than one would have expected from the population as a whole. And you see a very clear distinction for White being the way he's treated in Cambridge. It's an intellectual position. When he goes home to Islington, it's terrible. his parents are really upset and he's going to be white-feathered, and it's really quite stark, the sort of difference. So you kind of get interesting things like that. This is kind of interesting because here he's writing about something he's heard about Hardy. And Hardy's writing to Marcel Reece, who he's writing this book with. And Reece is in, White thinks he's in Copenhagen. Actually, he was in Stockholm. But anyway, so he says, Hardy had occasion to write to him on some mathematical subject. The letter contained a good many mathematical symbols. Also, he mentioned the name of a German worker at the end. The censor got hold of the letter, determined from the German name that it must be a code message, spent hours trying to interpret the symbols as a cipher, and then failing it, he didn't let the letter go through. So this is also another issue for us, is actually notation and symbols. For us, looking particularly, I think, for historians of earlier period, because there isn't standardized notation. It's a bit like there's non-standard spelling, but with mathematics, I would hazard a guess to say that it's slightly easier sometimes to work out a word someone's meaning if the spelling's not quite right, compared to if the mathematical symbols are different, or there may be a transcription error or something. So I think this is a very nice example of that. So this is another one. He goes to see The Birth of a Nation. Now this is a very famous film. It's a racist film. It's got hugely criticised for its kind of content, but for its the technology that was employed in it was really very cutting edge, and so it's kind of celebrated for the technological skill, but not for the content. But again, I think historians of film and things wouldn't necessarily think about going to the diary of a Cambridge student to get their reaction to the film. And as one of the things he says here, the pictures were, some of them, excellent, but the horses would gallop at about 100 miles an hour, and towards the end at about 200. So it's kind of how he's seeing the film. And of course, remember, going to the cinema in those days wasn't quite the same as going today. As far as the conscientious objection side of the story is concerned, White has to go up before the tribunals. They have these tribunals for people are called up for conscription, and as the war progressed, of course, conscription became more and more encompassing, and so we can learn quite. For me, learning about the First World War, it was an amazing sort of source in a sense, because here we have him saying the conscientious cases are reached. Soon became evident they wouldn't grant any exemptions, and the chairman asked each appellant whether he drank tea, and if so, whether this did not offend his conscience owing to the tax. I mean, sort of hearing these kinds of questions. And then he's told his appeal's dismissed, and he's got to take non-competent service, and he asked for leave to appeal further, and he's refused. So this is going on in Cambridge. Then he goes home, and his father and his sister are disappointed and upset because they think it's going to mean prison for him. And this is really obviously very distressing. He doesn't go to prison, actually, so he ends up with a friend's ambulance service. But there's a point during the diary where he thinks actually they have come and arrested Lancelot Hogburn, and he thinks they're going to be coming for him. So he puts all his library books in a pile in his room, so that they can be taken back to the library by somebody else in case they come and take him to prison. And then this one I think is interesting because here we have White going to the tribunal and listening to various cases, and he talks about, these are Glauert and Milne, both mathematicians, and then he mentions Eddington, and he says, it's undignified to see the Vice-Chancellor and the Master of John's pleading to be allowed to keep these men. What is the university coming to? And he also, in the diary, he keeps newspaper clippings as well. And one of the things that we can see from the newspaper clipping is that the university want to give Eddington exemption because they want him to carry on working in the observatory. Eddington's a Quaker. He wants it to go on the record that he wants exception for his beliefs. And so you see this sort of tension there. And Eddington is, of course, well known to historians of science and scientists and so on, as particularly for his work in helping to cement Einstein's theory of general relativity with the eclipse expedition. And I just thought it was quite appropriate perhaps to finish my talk with this, because of course this is the centenary of, and very recently, of Einstein's theory of general relativity. And it was Eddington's expedition to Principe, where they took the photographs of the star and showed that the gravitation would actually bend the path of light going around a massive star. And so then, of course, this led me to the Einstein archives online. So that's another fantastic archival resource for people working on Einstein or just generally interested in Einstein. And so with that, I'll finish. Thank you very much.